The topic is on shame, but first what I want to do is I want to differentiate what is the difference between guilt and shame, because they can often become like intertwined. And so I'm going to ask you all, what is the difference, if you had to put to words? Yeah.
I think guilt is recognition that you did something wrong or broke some sort of rule, and shame is more of the emotional response to guilt or a perception of guilt or inadequacy.
Yeah, beautiful. Yes. Guilt being something like I did wrong, shame being the emotional response to it. Yeah, I couldn't say that better. Anyone else want to add to that? I don't think we need to. I think what it could be is guilt is I did something wrong, like you said, a behavior. Shame is I am wrong. Like it becomes our identity. And so it's no longer kind of something I've done on the outside, but now I've become it. And so we've all experienced shame. Everybody has. We're all part of the fall here. So one more question for you guys. What does shame feel like? If you had to put it to words, when you're feeling shame, what do you feel?
Embarrassed.
Embarrassed? Mm-hmm. What else?
Could you ask that question again, please? Lynette was bugging.
Yeah. What does shame feel like? So we've all experienced shame. When you're feeling shame, what does it feel like? We have embarrassed. What else would you add?
Kind of want to run away.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Withdraw. Totally appropriate response.
Hide.
Hide. Speechless. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to put it to words because it's such a deep feeling, like you said, Matthew. Here are some examples, and this is not an infinite list, but feelings of being incapable, unimportant, worthless, feeling of not belonging, embarrassed is up there. Generally, just not feeling like you're good enough. So these are really, if you really sit and think about it, these are really deep, hurtful feelings. Also in differentiating guilt and shame, guilt is as powerful as shame. It can feel really deep, but its influence tends to be positive. We do something good if we stay in the guilt realm. And if you all attended Joy's talk a couple weeks ago on anger, she talked about how guilt can lead to repentance. That's a really good example. Shame, if we stay in shame, it tends to be destructive. And this is where we're going to talk a lot today on reframing shame so it doesn't have to be destructive, because we're all experiencing it at some point or another. And so what we can do with it. Before we get to what we can do with shame, we described what shame is. Here are a couple examples of what tends to trigger shame in us. So an example could be an inaccurate sense of self. And this could be on either extreme. This could be when you think you're really terrible and you're aware of that sense of self that you have, or on the other side, when you think that you're better than you are and it's revealed that you're actually not. So general inaccurate sense of self can trigger shame. Self-criticism can be a trigger to shame. Messages that we've internalized when we're young, and these tend to be messages that represent fears that we have. And along those lines, it's relational fear that tends to be triggered. This can be fear of being ordinary, fear of making a mistake, fear of not being loved, fear of inadequacy, fear of disappointing other people. And so it's not like safety fears. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about how relational fears tend to be the thing that triggers shame for us. Some of these things can be really healthy. So self-criticism can be really healthy. An accurate sense of self sometimes can be really healthy. It's mainly when these become really negative versions that then the behaviors that result in them can be destructive and harmful. So good if aligned properly, can turn into unhealthy shame if not. So this slide can kind of be more of an example of internal shame. It's shame that's caused internally by something externally. Here are some examples of external shame, like what on the outside could cause shame. Unwanted exposure, so that could be something internal that's exposed by another person or something external. Disappointed expectations, and I think we all know what that feels like. Exclusion, this can be social exclusion, exclusion of information, but just essentially feeling excluded. And unrequited love, so love that's not reciprocated. So we have internal triggers to shame, some external examples of triggers to shame. And then the last part I want to hit on here for triggers is emotional triggers. And this is where the last talks, I think, have been helpful because anger, anxiety, I threw up here envy as well, all can be emotional triggers to shame. Interestingly, that's usually the surface level emotion that we show. There's usually an emotion underneath that that's a little bit more vulnerable. And that tends to be sadness. So sadness tends to be this underlying emotion to these bigger ways that we express it. But it's not good to stay in sadness either. If we just stay in that realm, we're not really getting to the deeper issue of what's going on. I would put underneath sadness, shame. If only we could have the courage to go that deep to acknowledge our shame, I think we can have a better response to what we're going to do with it. This triangle looks like it's going down, but I would also say we could flip it around. Sometimes the first experience that we have is of shame. So we feel shame first, but that's too vulnerable of an emotion. So we then go on to the next level of emotion, and that could be sadness. But maybe that's too vulnerable to share with someone, so then I'm going to act out angrily, or I'm going to act out anxiously. So it can kind of go both ways. If you're experiencing an emotion, this might be a good insight to say, how vulnerable is it? And what am I willing to share with other people, and what am I actually trying to hide because it's too vulnerable? Shame could be at the top or the bottom of that. Along those lines, I would say that this is the, I would say, levels or layers of emotional vulnerability. So sadness and anger can be flipped. Someone might say it's too vulnerable to be angry. I was taught that I can't be angry. It's easier for me to show sadness. And so I would say, this can all be kind of worked around. Shame, though, usually either starts this cycle or it's underneath everything that this cycle embodies. So something that we're hiding from. All of these triggers, the internal, the external, the emotional triggers, have a general theme of noticing that we're not Christ. When we notice that we're not Christ, it's leading to this experience of shame. Therefore, I would say generally, shame is what broken communion feels like. It's what sin feels like. So shame in itself is not negative. These triggers aren't destructive in themselves. But the experience of shame can be something that we respond to in a really negative way. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Shame is healthy, though, because it is essential to growth. And so we need to access shame. We just need to not have the negative patterns of behaviors that tend to result in shame.
I'm sorry, I missed your intro. Did you give a definition of shame? What you mean when you're talking about shame?
Yes.
Is that something you're getting to?
No, we started there.
Okay,
So,
gotcha. I won't distract them though.
no, great. So we differentiated guilt from shame. Guilt being typically a behavior that you did something wrong, like feeling guilty about that. And shame being a deeper layer, emotional experience of that I am wrong. Then it's
Something's
becoming an
wrong with me.
identity. Yes, exactly. So we talked about different feelings of shame and anything from embarrassment, worthlessness, sense of not belonging. And then just went through a couple of triggers. The handout that I gave you all is reflection questions. It feels like, a counseling session or maybe like a little high school worksheet. But this is meant to be reflective to help you understand your fears, your relational fears a little bit more, and your shame triggers and your shame responses. And I feel like step one, as cliche as it sounds, is understanding where all of this stuff comes from. You can have better ability to do something with it.
Thank you.
No problem. So,
Can I ask you a question? Sorry, I just got in. I didn't mean to make so much noise. But how do you, in daily life, not just mentally in your mind, but in your heart and soul, turn it around.
Perfect. That's exactly what we're getting into next.
Okay.
So all we did was kind of define shame and kind of get an idea of what it looks like. And now we're going to go into exactly that, how to turn it around, what to do with it. And I will say for those who just joined, feel free to jot down questions, and we'll save it for the end, mainly because I think a lot of the questions will be answered, and if not, I want to make sure we get to them. It's like I ended on the actions that we exhibit with shame tend to be the things that are most negative. Typical unhealthy responses to shame. This is what we typically do when we experience shame. We just withhold. I think someone mentioned that, like just want to run away, not, be a part of anything. Closing yourself off, maybe that's really shutting down when someone's talking to you and you just stop interacting. Getting defensive, that can be angry, that can be almost like an anxious response. Just generally turning away in an unhealthy way, just not really wanting to engage. By doing this, we're further breaking away from communion. So again, unhealthy shame is when shame becomes our identity. So who I am is a problem. What we do to protect ourselves from that is we construct an identity where we can hide the shame, and we do all of these things to make sure that nobody sees the shame. Unhealthy shame is essentially, we can think about it, two extremes of pride. So unfortunately, by engaging in pride in either of these on either of these sides of the spectrum, it makes everything about us. So either we think we're way worse than maybe we are, or we think we're way better than we actually are. We have to understand that we're not perfect, but we're not terrible, we're not God, and we're also not just the dust of the earth. And so there's usually this balance here that's really what we're looking for in the middle. We do both sides of this pride spectrum to protect ourselves, and when we do that, we start behaving in ways that are incongruent with some of these deeper values that we have. And eventually, this leads to disconnection and separation from other people. So on the other hand, this is what healthy responses to shame would look like. Vulnerability, and this is both in being vulnerable to be aware of your shame when it's happening, and being willing to share it with another person. So you can't just be vulnerable by yourself. It's in response and in relationship. Openness, this is being open to the whole shame experience in general, not just staying in anxiety, anger, envy, whatever that emotional experience is. Curiosity to understand what's underneath the surface emotion that you're usually showing. And then turning towards somebody with love. And so you're not kind of running away, you're not trying to withdraw from it, but you're actually turning in and leaning into the discomfort of what shame experiences. Essentially, you're not taking things personal when you're exhibiting and trying to lean into healthy shame. So again, if we have this polarization of pride, healthy shame is kind of like finding a balance in the middle. And I try to think of an example and came up with this super hypothetical one of, giving a presentation on something that's like super sensitive and possibly really vulnerable, and getting feedback about it. And so I'm sitting trying to ask my husband, who's also a counselor, for feedback on, what do you think of my presentation? Ironically, having to deal with my own shame as I'm going through it. So I recognize my initial experience is a negative one. I kind of immediately jump into the anxiousness of it and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm such a failure. He's so much smarter than me. Unhealthy shame, perfect example. Then I also leaned into defensiveness of like, okay, you actually have no idea what you're talking about because I put a lot of work into this, and it could even go as much as like, I have a Ph.D., you don't know what you're talking about. Versus, and this did take 3 tries for me, as I'm actively working on this presentation, as we're getting in the depths of the feedback, recognizing the healthy shame response is saying, actually what I'm responding to is the vulnerability of getting feedback on something that feels very sensitive to me, something that I put a lot of hard work into, that I think my work means something, but at the same time could use a lot of work and growth, and finding that balance and acknowledging that, being open to all these emotions that are popping up, is essentially what healthy shame can look like. And that was a much better conversation when I could approach it that way as opposed to the defensive way. And luckily he's a counselor, so he spotted it right away and corrected me. So essentially, if we don't come to terms with our shame, we start defining ourselves by it, and then it shows up in our actions. And here are some ways that unhealthy responses can show up. We talked about moving away, so withdrawing, hiding, essentially not wanting, you're trying to cover up your shame. Moving against, that is trying to gain power over another person, so that could be an act of defensiveness. Moving toward, and this is interesting because on that healthy shame response, I put moving toward, turning toward someone with love. Here I mean turning towards somebody in a selfish or inauthentic way, kind of like people pleasing. Now you're moving toward them in a really inauthentic way, but you're trying to gain something out of it. So shame can look that way. It can look like projecting. We can project our shame onto other people. So maybe your shame starts at anger, and you feel shameful about it because you're exhibiting, some kind of angry response. And then you see somebody else get angry, and now you're experiencing shame for them, with them, toward them, and possibly getting angry at their own anger response because it's your response to your own anger. The other side of that is introjection. So somebody else's shame becomes my own. I'm using somebody else's shame against my weakness, my trigger of shame. So, if your trigger to shame is body image and someone is expressing and talking about how body image is, they're feeling uncertain about their own body image, it can trigger your own shame about your own. So it can be projected onto us or experiencing introjection. It can look like re-engaging in sinful behavior, but this time we're justifying it because we're trying to hide that shame and we're saying it's okay that I'm doing this because I'm protecting myself. And so we just kind of re-engage in patterns that aren't healthy in that way. And generally, a lack of love. Shame can only rise so far in any system before people stop engaging with it. So we stop showing up, we just don't care, we don't contribute. And so if you start experiencing any of these things, it's typically a response to that unhealthy shame. The emphasis here is that the behaviors that we experience with shame are what's problematic, not shame in itself. Again, we have healthy responses to it. The whole goal here is how to reframe shame. So now that we know what shame is and what it looks like, the goal here trying to reframe it, making it something healthy and helpful for us to look at, and literally not something to be ashamed of. Shame, thanks for the laugh there. Shame is what kind of like to wrap it up again, shame is a signal to us that something vulnerable is going on. It gives us insight into knowing that something emotionally triggering is happening. And what we do is we build up this armor of shame that tends to happen in our upbringing. And we go back to that place, we go back to that shame when we experience it as adults. So if we think of it that way, that shame response is really young. And if we can look at it that way, we can have a little bit more compassion toward it. In order to put that armor down and try something new, try a healthy response to shame, we need to see ourselves how we truly are, how God sees us, and not fall into these familiar fears, these familiar patterns that we tend to go. Father Stephen, I'm going to reference this book a lot. This is Face to Face Knowing God, for anyone new who came in. He says, the way of shame is the way of the Lord. And he describes how the gospel is a depiction of Christ, supremely self-emptying and humbling himself to the point of bearing our shame. He never broke communion. Even in the most humiliating experience, he was praying for those people that were hurting him. He didn't blame other people. He wasn't defensive, but he also wept, and he also acknowledged that what was happening wasn't right. So again, finding this balance of these two extremes that we can tend to go to. So we can't avoid shame. Acknowledging it and understanding it is what might bring us closer to God. And as long as we stay in the unhealthy shame realm, all we're doing is avoiding it. And by avoiding it, we don't have much control about how we're going to express it. Another way to put it, and this is from Timothy Batista, he says that healthy shame is feeling shame for things that we should feel shame for. So not wanting to betray something that is right. And unhealthy shame is not feeling shame for things that we should. Did I say that right? Yeah. And so actively betraying something that's right, you should feel shame for that. Unhealthy shame is holding on to something that you shouldn't hold on to.
And that's where we get the phrase, right? You should be ashamed of yourself.
Uh-huh. Yeah, probably, if we
Because
dig
you've done
deep.
something horrible.
Yeah. So with that, let's talk about ways that we can transform the shame. This might be getting to your question. Shame is something that separates us from others because we think that we're the only ones that experience it, but in all reality, we're all experiencing it in one way or another. We're all, again, part of that fall. And if we own it, we can connect again. Healthy shame requires love and acceptance to be healed. We can't do it alone. This has to be in relationship. If prideful behaviors, this extreme of pride, is involved in how we experience shame, then humility is going to be one of the ways that we can transform that. Humility in this sense is the ability to bear the burden of shame in the presence of another person and oneself. Okay? We can't do humility in itself. It's in response to something. You can't just, you can be humble, but typically to experience it, you have to use it in a response to something. So one way to do that is with vulnerability. And vulnerability is a form of humility because it makes us reflect on our actions and approach things through a lens of repentance. It's something, though, we often associate with weakness. So we think vulnerability in others is courage, but then we think vulnerability in ourselves is inadequacy. We're drawn to others' vulnerability and we lean into that, but then we get sick when we have to think about doing it ourselves. We want to experience others' vulnerability, but we don't want to share our own. Vulnerability is this birthplace of belonging, connection, love, joy, courage. It allows us the opportunity to connect with ourselves, others, and God. And connection is what we're all about because it provides us a sense of meaning and purpose to our lives. Numbing vulnerability dulls all those experiences. It dulls love. It dulls belonging. It dulls empathy. But vulnerability in this sense is giving your heart to another person. And if you were following along these talks, Stephanie gave a talk on conflict management, and she talked about, she quoted Father Evans' idea of what a healthy relationship can be comprised of, and there's 3 values within that. Trust, respect, and love. And so in order for a healthy relationship that you really want to engage in and you really can feel comfortable being vulnerable in, you've got to trust them, you've got to respect them, and you've got to love them. So it's not just being vulnerable and talking to anyone about everything that's going on. It's to the people who've earned the right to have that experience of you. It typically involves those 3 things. Trust lends itself to vulnerability because you need trust in a relationship to feel vulnerable, but you also need to feel vulnerable to be able to trust somebody. So that kind of underlies vulnerability. The Lenten retreat, one of the main themes that I took away from it was authentic self finds authentic relationships. That's with other people, that's with God. Vulnerability is one way to get more aligned with authenticity, is you're digging deeper to find those things that are more real to then engage in more of a real relationship with somebody. And that can align you closer to God by engaging in that too. When we attempt to avoid vulnerability, we start acting in ways that are incongruent because we're hiding, because we are ashamed, and so then we just start putting on a different face to protect ourselves and have to continue to enact that. Another example, or another way that you can lean into humility, is through prayer. Here, I'm thinking that prayer is the way that we can calm our fears, and we can settle into our heart where God can be present with us, where we can find the courage to face some of these vulnerabilities that are essentially really scary. Prayer can be an act of self-reflection that helps to bring us back into communion, and that's exactly what this handout is to help prompt, is self-reflection of gaining insight into why you do what you do, why you act certain ways or what triggers things for you. And then participating in prayer to ask for guidance on how to find the ability to weather moments of healthy shame without becoming overcome with anxiety, envy, anger, any of these external triggers or internal triggers to shame. Prayer is also helpful because it can open a space to allow God in. A lot of the homilies, again, since I chose the topic on shame, I've recognized a lot of the homilies have been on this emphasis of how we reject God and reject God's forgiveness specifically. And if we create shame as an identity, we're already putting this wall up where other people, including God, can't come in. We can't allow that forgiveness in, and forgiveness is so essential for shame.
Yeah, we don't feel we're worthy.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That feeling unworthy is a huge wall to distance you're even further and further from the person who is trying to tell you you are. And this leads perfectly into the next part, which is repentance. So Father Stephen says, if loss of communion is the beginning of sin, then restoring communion is the beginning of salvation. In order to restore communion, we have to face unhealthy shame with healthy shame. So by being vulnerable, by having humility, by finding your authentic self and actually living in that. Facing unhealthy shame also means facing other things in our lives that are distorted. So he says, I cannot be who I am without accepting the legitimacy of who I am not. And he says, we cannot love if we do not know that we ourselves are loved. But we cannot forgive until we know ourselves to be forgiven. So we have to have the vulnerability to understand what we're not in order to engage in repentance. Repentance, in this way, I'm also thinking that it's having the courage to see God within us. This unhealthy shame response is an example of a lack of courage to see God within us and accept his love. Shame derives its power. This is all what this book is about, Daring Greatly. Shame derives its power from being unspeakable and not shared. So one way to do that is talk about it. Confession, talk with a priest, talk with a trusted person. But the longer that we hold shame in, it just starts becoming us. And we need to almost externalize it to no longer hold on to it. And there was a research has shown, I wouldn't say one research study, but multiple research studies have shown that the act of not talking about a traumatic experience could actually cause more damage than the actual trauma itself, highlighting that the longer we hold it in, it's causing damage, and it's making possibly this one experience of shame even larger. But if there's any theme of this conversation, it's that there's polarities to a lot of things. So not talking about it is problematic, but I would say the other side is also problematic. Going and telling everyone about your shame and everyone about your trauma keeps you stuck in it, keeps you reliving it. So again, trying to find this balance of trying to not stay on the extremes. Father Evan always talks about just having to get up one more time after you fall, just one more time. So recognizing you're having difficulty with some aspects of this shame, this unhealthy shame, and then figuring out how to turn yourself around to start engaging in something healthier. I'm going to leave you with two quotes from Father Stephen. He says, "We cannot see Christ face to face without encountering our own shame." And this falls so perfectly today, not only along the lineup of all the other talks, but with the Good Samaritan homily today. I'm just listening. Maybe I'm just like, shame's on my mind and I see it everywhere. But what a perfect example of how facing your own shame brings you closer to God, and how it can bring you closer to community and connection. And if we can come to understand and accept it, how beautiful, how your life can just change as a result of that. And personally, I'll say I was baptized 3 years ago and gave the life confession, and I can't put it to words, but if I could put it to words, that would be this whole talk. how life confession, how confession during Lent, all these different confessional periods, if you really believe it and really use it as a way to let go of that unhealthy shame and lead toward healthy shame, how transformative it could be, which is kind of why I really want to put that word here. It's not enduring shame, it's transforming it. The last quote, me and my husband love this one. It's bear a little shame. So when you notice yourself in a shame situation, telling yourself, like, how can I bear just a little bit of shame? You don't have to go super deep, but how can I, like, just have a little bit of it? And how can it actually help the situation? And so I joke about it because if you're here with a friend or a spouse, or if you talk about this with somebody that's close with you, they can also call you on it. You know, when they're starting to see these unhealthy shame responses in you, and me and my husband do this now a little bit, where we're like, hey, bear a little shame. And it's like a nice reminder to be like, I'm doing that, like, defensive thing again. So how can I, like, bear a little bit, because I am starting to feel that. And so, yes, and so I'll leave this slide up, but I'm happy to go back to any slides since I paused all your questions. But I'll just real quick reference the handout, and then we can jump into questions. This handout kind of hits on different things that we talked about. It can help you identify what are those relational fears that tend to trigger shame. So in order to get out of shame, it has to be in a relationship, but in order to experience it, it tends to be in relationship too. I can't think of a great idea or example off the top of my head, but I'm just thinking, like, if I'm eating cookies in the car by myself, maybe I'm not feeling a lot of shame, like if I'm smuggling it, you know, but as soon as I go home with my husband and he sees it all in my car, then I experience shame. So it's usually in relationship with other people that you experience it. This will help you identify what are those fears, how is shame being triggered in those relationships. And then it lists out a couple questions to really help you think about, like, what tends to trigger your shame, what are your shame emotional responses, the external responses, and then also, really, if you really want to reflect on it, what's underneath that you're so scared of showing, and why are you trying to protect that? So I am happy to take any questions now, and I'm also going to just have a caveat here that we have 2 other counselors in the room, and so I'm not claiming to be an expert here, but if you all want to jump in with any responses or have anything else to share, I'm also happy to take your feedback, or, like, take your responses to questions. What are your thoughts? What are your questions?
Do you think everybody has a shame response, or I guess let me rephrase, what would you do with somebody that doesn't seem to have any shame for things that they probably ought to?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, are they just suppressing that? Do they really not feel shame for some of the things they do? Does that make sense?
I would say, ironically, that could be a shame response, is I'm going to double down and show that I am not impacted by this, and because the harder thing is to accept that I am impacted by this. And so that's why I think shame can be on this polarization. Some people experience shame of, like, I'm not good enough, and almost like self-pitying. And then some people go to the opposite side of pride, where it's like, well, I'm better than everyone, and, you know, I don't experience shame. But it's more of an act to harden up, hide that shame even more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you mentioned these kind of like larger than life personas, either more better than everyone else or worse than everyone else. Do you have any experience or knowledge on, like, what happens when someone flips between the two all the time?
I think we all so the question was, what happens when we flip from one polarization to the other, or one side of the spectrum? I think we actually do that in order to find balance. So I can think of several examples in my life. I want to change something, so I'm going to go to this extreme, somehow fail at that, and it puts me back to this extreme, and then I realize, I like went too far there, and I need to find my balance. So it's not uncommon that maybe you start at one end of the spectrum. In order to correct that and say, I'm going to stop self-pitying myself, I jump to saying, like, well, I'm going to just be confident, and then that goes into too far of the other extreme, and then we get, revealed to us that we're overly confident or something like that, and then that helps bridge us back to the middle. But ironically, I'm thinking professionally, and personally, a lot of experiences have been going from one side to the other of some kind of dynamic, and the goal is actually to find a really nice middle ground. But you kind of have to experience both to really understand what this is. So I think that's pretty common.
It almost sounds like you're saying it's healthier to flip back and forth between one or the other, as long as you eventually stabilize in the middle rather than staying in one or the other?
I think it's an appropriate reaction, and then the healthy part would be to use that to help you find the balance. Not healthy to constantly flip, but healthy to use that as a sense to like, okay, I'm really missing the mark every time I keep going. But I think we need to do that to get there.
So, excuse me, of course, we need to use our mind to analyze and look at and prayerfully consider where we are and what we're doing, you know, the whole picture. But at what point does it become the heart getting involved?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, God forgive me, a sinner. There's this whole, I want to repent. I know
Yeah.
I've done wrong. I want to repent. But then that can go too far.
Yes.
Like
Yep.
I'm not worthy to repent.
Yep.
So how is God going to accept my repentance?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And how bad is it really?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know.
Keep going.
I guess I'm very analytical, so I can
Mm-hmm.
analyze this stuff all day long, but then I don't feel that frees me
Yeah.
to do differently.
Yes. And I bring this slide back up. So the question was, how do we bring it from the head back to the heart? And I bring this slide up because I think a lot of this top part of the triangle is heady type things.
Okay.
Shame is closer to the heart. But I almost wish I did this instead, but it kind of goes down like this, and I would just flip it and have it do this again. And sometimes we can go head, and we get to heart, and heart's super vulnerable, and it's harder to stay there that we just jump straight back to head, you know? So we can experience all of this heady stuff, try to make sense of what's going on. I would even clump sadness in there, even though it feels like more of a heart emotion, but it's more of a cognitive response. I feel like if we can stay here a little bit more and really understand our triggers to this and what it is that like is just so emotionally triggering, I can't think of another word, this is where we're gonna have the biggest impact. If we stay too much in sadness, even, because that even feels closer to the heart, that's not healthy either, because then we just lead to despair or something like that. So I feel like if we stay here, but again, not jump, because I feel like if you do the go to shame and then jump to like, well, I'm really not worthy to get repentance at all, then we're just cycling back to this, you know? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah? Do you guys have other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, somatically, like what our bodies do when we're ashamed. You know, like your face might get red or whatever. Like, I think everybody understands what shame feels like, but I don't know that we understand when we flipped to one extreme or the other, and what it feels like to be in the middle, and what it feels like in our bodies to bear a little shame. So if you want to talk to that would be awesome.
Yes.
Or if anybody wants to throw
I
in
know,
about
yeah.
that. Yeah.
I might post that to everyone before I jump in, but
Okay.
like, do we know what that feels like? Like, or even if you had a guess, what's it feel like to sit in that discomfort of being in the middle when you're used to being on the outsides of the spectrum? Even just a hypothetical, what do you think that feels like?
Can you clarify what you mean about the polar extremes of the spectrum? Like what are we measuring?
Yeah. I use the example of pride in a sense because I feel like humility is a big factor to help us overcome shame or transform shame. So I think the spectrum would be two sides of unhealthy shame, and the middle is healthy shame. So unhealthy shame can be really low. So I'm unworthy and I'm not good enough, and that's how I respond to shame, is just completely shut down and just say everyone's better than me. The other side of that spectrum is I'm better than everyone else and I'm trying to, cover up that shame. I'm really getting defensive and angry. And so I would say maybe healthy shame is a middle ground of that.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, like, I'm just like talking out loud kind of, but what you said earlier about like It seems like when you're in one of the extremes, you're thinking, I'm this, I'm that, and when you're in healthy shame, you're just feeling, you're just like,
Yeah.
it just, like you're not thinking,
Yeah.
you're just feeling and bearing it.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Do you think
I think that's
right?
a beautiful way of
Okay.
putting that.
Because like as you were explaining it, that's what I was thinking. I was like,
Yeah.
I think I'm so great. I think I'm so awful. You know, but you're not, when you're
You're not thinking.
bearing it, you're not thinking about yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And that could be a way to recognize where we are at the moment. 'Cause
Mhm.
I find that to be the most difficult thing, you know.
Well, and
is
I'll go
this
back.
healthy? Is this unhealthy? Is
Yes.
this- you
I'm
just
going to
go
get to you in a
Yeah.
second. But I'm going to go back to that example that I gave of myself, obviously, with this presentation and getting the feedback and recognizing, yeah, I'm in these two extremes and how I'm acting, and then sitting in that middle ground to say, like, just even acknowledging this, almost like a, not an out-of-body experience, but taking an objective stance to say, this is a really vulnerable situation for me, and I'm doing this with a trusted person, and I'm still responding this way. And his feedback's super helpful. Like, I have to cognitively be aware of the situation, but staying in healthy shame requires that heart, requires that feeling, requires you to almost bring all of it together. My behaviors, my thoughts, and my feelings are all aligned together. I'm not just putting my thoughts and my behaviors above one or the other. What were you gonna add?
That's kind of the same lines that I was thinking, but I'm on either polar opposite. It feels like disconnection or disassociation,
Yeah.
so you don't have to feel anything. So
Yeah.
you're disconnected from your emotions, kind of protecting yourself. So if you're super prideful, then you don't have to feel ashamed. Or if
Exactly.
you're on the other side of the spectrum, you're
Yeah.
so shameful that no one else can, like you're beneath others' reproach because you're so shameful.
Yeah.
So you don't have to feel it.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
And I would almost challenge you, complete this with your head, and then throw that away and complete this with your heart. And you're gonna have different responses. But I think if you, whatever your first response is gonna be, is likely a head response of like, oh yeah, this is what, triggers that. But if you really, really reflect on it and dive deep, I think you're gonna get to that, exactly what you just referenced.
I wanted to try two things here. And tell me if I misunderstood this again on the extremes, right? Those are extreme responses to, in both cases, unhealthy shame. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, because part of the way I understood Matthew's question was people who decline to feel healthy shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like the sort of thing that we would say he's shameless, where he's not, well, I don't mean that he couldn't possibly be covering up some deep shame, but he would actually be, the person would actually be a little baffled if you suggested to them that their behavior was out of bounds.
Yeah.
And so the problem there is different than those two
Yes.
extremes. It's
Yeah.
the not feeling, right? And then the very first slide, when we first started the session, you can if you want, we started with unhealthy shame, and that seems to be mostly what we're talking about. And maybe that's a bigger problem,
Yeah.
right? Maybe we can sort of roughly presume that we're pretty good at the healthy kind of shame, like, showing up dressed like a pink rabbit to work or something like that, right? Oops, right? So I was trying to do a slide like before your first slide where the definition or the explanation involved something that was neutral that we would then, and this might be done immediately or come to be done quickly, where like contributing a boundary. And then we decide and figure out whether it was a legitimate boundary, like being rude, constantly interrupting someone, or an illegitimate one. And that would diverge to one or the other kind of healthy or unhealthy shame.
Yeah.
Haven't finished this book, but there's a book called For Shame, which is sort of a play on words, right? Because it's about the good kind of shame. And so, Christian philosopher, evangelical kind of side of angle. And so I expect him to kind of get into that. So that was just something that I was kind of thinking about.
Yeah.
The second thing I was thinking about was we seemed not only that it was mostly unhealthy shame that we talked about, but that we were talking about moments of shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like this thing occurs, and in that moment you feel shame,
Mm-hmm.
right? How is it, I want to ask it open-endedly.
Sure.
How is it connected to, or in what ways does it, but I also have this sort of notion that will it always end up, as you drove down, right, beyond that moment, will it always be connected to some kind of systemic or foundational or like generational shame? Like if you're ashamed, if you feel unhealthy shame in the moment, like it's not random,
Yeah.
right? You have certain assumptions or expectations, and those are connected to experiences, and people might say childhood, or the family systems people might say when you were 12, or when you were 9, or when you were 6, or all of those, like that. So is that going to end up being, generally speaking, the route? Like, we don't just continually randomly experience moments of shame.
Yes, yeah. I think my perspective, my thought, and this is where and maybe approaches come or can think differently, but I would say a lot of it is relational fear, and that can be
And even that's
systemic.
going to be down to something
Right.
where
Like you're generally,
child
we all
development,
have
attachment
one.
theory, all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. We all have a relational fear at the core. And then in a moment, it might bring up one aspect of that, you know, like, and maybe there's a general name to it, but I know when I present myself like Father Evan said, Dr. Chelsea Martin, and I immediately was like, everyone's going to think I'm, you know, super smart. And immediately my fear of like, yeah, but my immediate fear of like, I am going to be, you know, it's going to be shown that I'm not living up to this. And then you know, there's the parish assembly, and then I'm like, oh, what if nobody comes? And then my fear of, am I worthy enough? Like, does anyone even, you know, like all of it just like, there's a general fear, and these situations bring about whatever's going to flower up out of that. And so ideally, that's what I feel like if we really reflect at the core and understand what is that fear that's coming out, you're going to notice it when it starts coming out. Like even just working on this, and literally that example, and that's my whole vulnerability to you guys today of like getting that feedback from my husband, and it's just like I'm recognizing it in the moment and how transformative that can be, but also how you have to be able to bear it. You have to be able to sit with it to say, wow, I realize how quick it's to go there and how hard it is to stay here, how hard it is to stay in this moment and accept this and recognize that this actually is connecting us closer. And if I do anything different, it's probably going to create a distance for us. So I actually put a lot of unhealthy stuff on here because I think that's actually more familiar to us. And the healthy part is actually more simple. I could give a million examples of what an unhealthy shame looks like because we live this often. The healthy part is literally the opposite of it. And that's where I feel like, you know, if I can explain unhealthy shame, then healthy shame seems a little easier. Harder to get to, but easier to understand.
Mm-hmm.
The bearing a little shame, or bear a little shame, is that the phrase? It seems like, I don't know if in context it is, but it seems like it could apply to either, and that the action of it would separate you from the experience in a good way, not like I didn't really do that, but like where you can stop, like in the Great Divorce, you can stop looking at yourself for 20 seconds and then
like take
you're
a
on the
step
right
back,
path,
don't
right?
get defensive, don't take it personal, take a step back, recognize the situation. Yeah.
There was a question over here, I think.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So if the shame is like, I assume if it feels too heavy, does that mean it's
I think I think the weight of it can actually be really healthy and good. If it's kind of the behavior that's coming out of it that can be problematic, not necessarily the weight of what's happening. Because sometimes I can think of experiences where, you know, you are feeling unworthy and it feels heavy, but it's very powerful to recognize that's putting my pride aside. And if we can, and then it's what you kind of do next with it.
Is it just trusting God that He'll give you the strength to carry it, kind of thing?
I think that's part of prayer, is helping to guide, to make sure I have the right path into what I'm going to do next for that, but trust. And I think in that example of like whether I'm worthy or not, trust would be a really good way in the right direction in that. But I guess it's not, I think that's why I bring up these two extremes, is because it can be like low unworthiness, but it also can look like pride. And if we say, well, I'm just going to trust in God that I'm going to like keep doing great, like that's not always helpful. So it depends on what side of the extreme you're on. Yeah, keep going with it.
I'm just thinking my own experience with healthy and unhealthy shame. And when I feel healthy shame, it's not unmanageable. It's uncomfortable, but I don't feel like I'm going to die.
Yeah.
When I'm feeling unhealthy shame, I feel like I'm going to die. I want to go away, you know. So I like to kind of answer your question. If you're feeling shame and it's painful, I would look at what other emotions am I feeling too, in conjunction with that, and those might be the things that are trying to pull you to an extreme.
Isn't it supposed to be kind of painful?
It's uncomfortable. Sorry, I'm sitting here so no one will bump this, and then I bumped it. But it's uncomfortable, yes, and some people might experience that uncomfort as pain. But God will never give you a pain, like He will not give you pain that you can't bear.
I don't
Right?
think He'll give us pain at all.
But God will allow you to be uncomfortable.
But there's a distinction to be made between pain and discomfort.
Yes.
Physical, emotional. Pain is something that if you continue to do it, you're going to hurt something. And discomfort is something that if you continue to do it, you might even actually help.
Yeah, I just think of a personal example, I won't give the details, but anyway, like I was preparing for confession and I knew there was this one big thing I needed to confess that I was guilty of. But it was a big struggle with shame. I was so embarrassed and I went, you know, I'm a terrible, awful person to, well, maybe I don't have to confess that, you know, my pride.
Perfect, yeah.
And I had to work through it, I guess, just to share that, you know, I had to get to that place of healthy shame. And the irony was, when I went to confession, I said, you know, the biggest confession I have is not this other thing I'm going to tell you in a minute, but it's the unhealthy shame that I was, and that was the biggest confession, and it and then when I got to the other thing, it was like not such a big deal.
It's too bad they don't call it illusion instead of confession.
Just say, you know, the struggle was there that I had to get to that point of healthy shame. I still was ashamed of the thing I did that I was guilty of, but I was like, boy, this big thing just almost canceled my appointment, you know, because I can't tell him that, you know, what will he think of me, you know, again, that big struggle with the unhealthy shame. So just to share that I think, you know, that can, well, we won't share, that unhealthy shame can really interfere with a healthy confession.
Yeah.
So.
And I think, like, to Paul's point, that if there's something other than just that uncomfortable shame feeling, if you're also feeling unworthy, you know, that's not from God, you know. So like then you need to separate those two feelings so that you can feel the appropriate shame, but you also need to deal with whatever it was from your childhood that's trying to pull you out of the healthy shame into an unhealthy place.
Yeah.
But
Sometimes I talk with my clients about, like, you've got to get in the hole. A lot of times we're so scared of falling into the pit of the hole, and so then we're just like hanging onto the side, but then you're not really feeling it. You're not really in the depths of it, but you're also doing so much to protect yourself from it. And so sometimes we kind of have to get into the hole to really figure out how to get out. Otherwise we're just hanging on this edge for as long as we can protect ourselves. And so I feel like that kind of goes to all your points, but to the weight of it, it's like, I don't think weight is unhealthy. I think it can be really informative. And then it can get really relieved after that. I mean, that's what I felt like, if I could put word to words, is what Life Confession felt like. It's like how long I was holding this weight, and then I just got lighter. And it's a feeling. Oh,
Freedom.
yes, freedom's a great word.
And Jesus felt things like super deep, right?
Yeah.
So like, I also think that's a gift, right, of having that vulnerability.
Yeah.
Being able to feel the weight of something.
Yeah.
And then, but then accepting the forgiveness,
Yes.
going to confession, right? There's the verse that says, confess your sins to one another and you shall be healed. And that's why Satan tries to keep us from that. We don't want to tell people, we're worried what they're going to think. That's pride. It's this whole thing.
Yes.
So we probably have time for like maybe one more question, one more thought.
Okay, I have two. Is that okay? I'm gonna go
Yeah.
here and then I'll go here.
I mean, it seems like you've presented the antidote to all of this as being connection
Yeah.
and being vulnerable with people. What advice would you have for someone without, I'll call it a vulnerability network, right? How do you begin? How do you build that from foundation zero?
Yeah.
Good question.
That's a really good question, because I do think that relationships help us confront these things. It helps us become aware of these things. Like we can't do anything, any growth without relationship. And so you have to have a group, but it's not just any relationship. You're talking about like, how do I have relationship, a closer group of people, or a group of people I feel the closest to that I can do this with, right? So it's not just like, how do I just meet people, but how do I like actually find my people I can be vulnerable with?
Well, people don't want to meet you sometimes where you are. Like, I'm very vulnerable, but I have a hard time meeting people that are able to get on that same
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
Makes them
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
I think the question being like, how do you build a group of people with which you can practice this?
Yeah. That's a
That's a
great
big
question
question.
that I feel like I wish I just had a sentence answer for.
It's
For
just
me,
participation, right? It's, you gotta be there and
my counselor hat would say
do it.
everyone's reason that's inhibited might feel a little different, and so wanting to explore what's kind of getting in the way of yours, and so because sometimes it is like a social anxiety participation, sometimes it is not feeling connected because we're on very different levels here, and so this is where I'm going to give the general answer of like maybe talking to a counselor, talking to someone you do trust, talking to Father Evan, like something where it can help break away and help you identify like how do I connect. And sometimes it's you, most times it's you, and it's the people you're around. So maybe the people you're trying to connect with aren't the people that are going to be it. If you've been trying this hard for this long, or maybe there is a block that is something on your end that needs to break through to like help that connection grow.
You have to be
If I can
purposeful about
carry it
that.
back, it sounds like you're saying that it's a natural thing it's something that occurs naturally, and if it's not occurring naturally, it's due to a block that needs to be overcome, not necessarily a lack of skill that needs to be developed.
It could be either one.
I think it can be both.
Okay.
I think that's what I would say to really uncover what could be the block, is to really I think that's going to be personal to every single person. And so it could be a skill thing, it could be a context thing, it could be a relationship thing. So that's why it's hard to give like a one word or like not generalized answer. But I think that's where it starts. So if you're noticing like that's probably your underlying triggers, I don't belong, like I'm not connected. That's where we want to start then.
Can I say something about that? Because I had this experience this week
Sure.
with something I did that I was really ashamed of. And
Thank you for being vulnerable.
It had to do with anger. And so I was talking to a good friend. Now, she's a close friend. I've known her since college. And we've shared lots of personal stuff. And so I shared with her this action, and she's like, oh, Margaret, I don't think that's such a big deal. I wouldn't even worry about it because of this, this, and this. going, I still feel bad, so I can't. I appreciated her answering me on it, but that I don't truly believe what she said in this situation is accurate. So, and she's not Orthodox, so there's a whole different perspective. But yeah, I'm gonna go to confession. But the other thing is, I was gonna say, is that I think it really requires almost a person who, like Father Evan, who's a priest or trained, really well trained in the faith and in helping people with these issues. And because I just, you know, I've done a lot of this work, and sometimes I just need another knowledgeable spiritual perspective. So there's that. And then I don't want to take more than my turn, but where does the Jesus prayer come in? And being, what is the word that we use as Orthodox? Not disconnected, but
Detached.
thank you. Detached. Where does, like, when we reach detachment, which I don't know if I'll ever get to, but if we reach detachment, then there's none of this other junk affecting, none of these thoughts affecting our response, because we're healed of all the emotional trauma, right? And so it's just God and me, God and my neighbor. I don't know, it just seems so much simpler. Like, if I can just pray the Jesus prayer all day long, I'm never fall into this unhealthy shame as much because I'm not in a place to go there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think, I mean, something I thought of while you were talking, and maybe I'm not tracking, but there's a place for like a stillness and a pause, and not just an immediate reaction. And I feel like when you said, where does the Jesus prayer come in, and like maybe if I pray this, then it's gonna orient me and I can just stay in this place. That reminds me of in the example, husband's giving me feedback, if I could pause and reflect almost in that way, I don't have to go to unhealthy shame immediately. But usually unhealthy shame is the reaction, is the without the stillness, without the pause. And I feel like it's in those moments of pause that then we can, like you were saying, kind of like take a step back, be objective, let God in, not let your own pride in, and maybe feel more attached that way, to go along with the detachment. Does that, like, would you guys add anything, Brenda or Lynette, or does that feel like it hits on your point?
Kind of what I'm hearing you say, how I would rephrase it for my own brain, is that detachment seems to be a natural consequence. It's not our end goal. It's just a natural consequence. That when we stop, our job is to stop and to pause, and then the detachment is a natural outflowing of paying attention to the right thing. Does that make sense? Is that what you were saying?
Or maybe being attached to God. Having a healthy attachment to God.
Yeah, would be
will allow the detachment, because He's the one that matters most.
Yeah.
So.
But you have to create a space for Him, right? You've got to create a space for all of these non-cognitive things to settle in. And so I think that maybe that's where it's at.
Okay, thank you.
I will say, I am humbled by this participation. It's very vulnerable. This is a topic that I literally expected no one to come to, because who's going to show up to that unless you are willing to be vulnerable, and you guys clearly are, and sharing your own things too. But just humbled because it's such a busy day, and it's a late afternoon, and so I appreciate you even just participating to keep it going. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you took something away from today. But thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chelsea.